Still, in the early years, the English settlers most frequently contrasted themselves with Negroes by the term Christian, though they also sometimes described themselves as English.
This is talking about the earlier years in the American colonies and how the English colonizers who settled the land, they initially made distinctions between themselves and others like the Negroes by referring to themselves as Christians, right? And so words like opposite, contrast, difference, and other synonyms, these are keys to understanding this topic that we're talking about today. And so what I want you to do is pay close attention to how Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan describes the process of how the English created differences between themselves and others like the Negroes and the Indians. And so for us to do that, we got to continue reading in the book right here, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812, and see if we can get some understanding.
The historical experience of the English people in the 16th century had made for fusion of religion and nationality. The qualities of being English and Christian had become so inseparably blended that it seemed perfectly consistent to the Virginia Assembly in 1670 to declare that no Negro or Indian, though baptized and enjoying their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians, but yet not debarred from buying any of their own nation.
In this context, the word Christian means person of European descent and more specifically English descent. And so it was not allowed for the free Negro or Indian to buy any Christian or English person as a slave, but they were most definitely allowed to buy slaves from their own group, right? And which they did. And so the English Christian was allowed to own other English Christians as well as Negroes and Indians. And since Negroes and Indians were only allowed to own those from their own stock at this time, what this shows is that the English elite didn't want images planted in people's minds of seeing any of those members from other groups owning those of the Christian English stock. And so this was strategic in setting the differences in status as to who was and who was not meant to be slaves in that society.
From the first, then, vis-a-vis the Negro, the concept embedded in the term Christian seems to have conveyed much of the idea and feeling of we as against they.
We, the English Christian, upstanding, noble, and chosen by God, and they, the Negro, or black people, wicked, destructive, who were created to be slaves and slaves for the Christians.
To be Christian was to be civilized rather than barbarous, English rather than African, white rather than black.
You see that? Christian was tied together with civilized, English, and white. And what does white represent in Western culture? It represents purity, honesty, morally pure, enlightened, right? And then we have barbarous, African, and black. And what does black mean in Western culture? It means wicked, bad, disastrous, calamitous, without light, immoral, devilish, unlawful, right? And many more other wild things, right? And so this is the contrast that was created with these two opposing identities, which gives insight as to why the English colonizers chose to use them in their tactics for domination.
The term Christian itself proved to have remarkable elasticity,
meaning it could be changed and used for all types of occasions and stretched to mean different things, right? Elastic and stretchable like a rubber band.
For by the end of the 17th century, it was being used to define a species of slavery which had altogether lost any connection with explicit religious difference. In the Virginia Code of 1705, for example, the term sounded much more like a definition of race than of religion. And for a further Christian care and usage of all Christian servants, be it also enacted by the authority aforesaid, and it is hereby enacted that no Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, although Christians or Jews, Moors, Mahometans, or other infidels, shall at any time purchase any Christian servant, nor any other, except of their own complexion, or such as are declared slaves by this act.
Negro, mixed breed, or Indians, even if they were Christians, could only own Christian servants that shared the same skin color as them. And so the English Christians could own members from all the groups. But as more people were becoming Christians, they wanted to make it clear that there was still a distinction that needed to be established.
By this time, Christianity had somehow become intimately and explicitly linked with complexion. It is worth making still closer scrutiny of the terminology which Englishmen employed when referring both to themselves and to the two peoples they enslaved, for this terminology affords the best single means of probing the content of their sense of difference.
Now notice here that Dr. Winthrop Jordan says the terminology English used when referring to themselves and the people they enslaved. This is important because the English picked the identities for themselves, but the enslaved Black and Indians were given those identities, right? And they were given those identities by the conquerors, which is a huge difference.
The terms Indian and Negro were both borrowed from the Hispanic languages, the one originally deriving from mistaken geographical locality and the other from human complexion.
The other, called Negro or black, derived from an exaggerated human complexion, which the people calling themselves black today don't have, right? Look down at any skin color of a person who thinks he or she is a black person, and you'll see clearly that they have a skin complexion ranging from a light brown to a very rich brown, right? And everything in between, right? All but the color of black, right? Which is one of the reasons why it looks super crazy when people are walking around calling themselves that.
When referring to the Indians, the English colonists either used that proper name or called them savages, a term which reflected primarily their view of Indians as uncivilized, or occasionally, in Maryland especially, pagans, which gave more explicit expression to the missionary urge.
The proper name he's talking about is Indian, so they either used Indian or savage, both terms which summed up what the colonizers saw these people as, which was without any law and without any order and without knowledge of the human invented Christian God, right? And so this allowed the Christian missionaries to go in and teach these people about the European Jesus, which further enslaved their minds.
When they had reference to Indians, the colonists occasionally spoke of themselves as Christians, but after the early years, almost always as English.
The colonizers spoke of themselves as Christian, right? And then they later referred to themselves mostly as English. The key here being that they were the ones picking these identities and their own names. And they were also changing them when they saw it convenient, right? Which is what we'll see more of as we continue going. Just watch.
In significant contrast, the colonists referred to Negroes and by the 18th century to blacks and to Africans, but almost never to Negro heathens or pagans or savages.
The colonizers picked the names Negro, Black, and African for those people, which means that they didn't have a choice as to what they would call their own selves, right? Which in their right mind most certainly would not have been Negro or Black.
Most suggestive of all, there seems to have been something of a shift during the 17th century in the terminology which Englishmen in the colonies applied to themselves.
Here we go. Now I'm curious to know what this shift in terminology was that the English used to identify themselves, right? Not something that someone else created for them, but something that they created for themselves. I wonder what that was.
From the initially most common term Christian, at mid-century, there was a marked drift toward English and free. After about 1680, taking the colonies as a whole, a new term appeared, white.
White was the new term that the English transformed themselves into. See, people walk around with the belief that people called white have always, throughout all history, been known as white, right? And this is nowhere near reality, right? The English people became white in the 1600s. And think about it. The people who colonized the America starting in the 1600s were primarily English, and they stayed here and they had kids and descendants. And so today here in America, why is it that we never hear anyone saying that they're English? Where did all those English colonizers and their descendants go? They didn't just disappear, right? What happened is that they transformed into white people, both legally and socially. And why did they drop that precious English name with all that history to become white? It was to make a clear distinction between themselves and those who were named black people, right? And it was a brilliant strategy, right, for this purpose and to achieve this objective that they had in mind, right? It worked like a charm, right? And it was to create a massive division for the purpose of dominating another group. This is why I say don't ever underestimate these colonizers, right, and what they did, especially the English, because they were willing to do whatever it took to completely subdue the people that they were after, right? And going as far as even changing their own identity to accomplish that goal. And so this black and white conflict that still goes on today, it stems from this pit that the colonizers dug out, right? And so we stopped calling ourselves black many years ago, right? Especially after recognizing that it was an inappropriate identity and it was part of a game that the colonizers had set up, right? And so many of you, you'll have to do the same thing, especially if you want to climb on the ladder rung by rung out of the pit and into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. Right, and so this is the end of part 5 commentary on the book here, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812 by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.